But I am here, Mr. President, today to talk about the situation in Ukraine. And as we look around the world, there's so much happening and so much which is of concern to our country. But today I'd like to focus on Ukraine and what Russia is doing in eastern Ukraine to interfere with the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, to interfere with their choice of how they want to conduct their country, the choices that they have a right to make for their own country. And of course, this began with the illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea. But it has not stopped there. It has continued in eastern Ukraine, where essentially you've seen violence and turmoil in parts of eastern Ukraine. And make no mistake what the cause of that violence and turmoil by the so-called separatists that are causing this violence in eastern Ukraine. The cause is very clear. Vladimir Putin and Russia hold the key to that violence. They hold the key and are as responsible for that violence as they are as responsible for the illegal invasion of the Crimea. And in fact, I would say that Vladimir Putin really has operational or control of what's happening. He could ask those separatists to stop what they're doing. He could stop giving them arms. He could stop doing the things that he has been doing, including giving them the capability of shooting down Ukrainian planes, giving them the capability of tanks, arms, all that the Ukrainian people are trying to deal with. And what do they want? The Ukrainian people want to determine their own future. They want Vladimir Putin and Russia to butt out. They want Russia to respect their sovereign territory, and unfortunately, none of this is happening. Now, recently, I had the honor of leading a delegation to Ukraine to oversee the presidential election last month. I had the chance to sit down and meet now elected President Poroshenko in Ukraine. I also had the chance to meet many people in Ukraine and to see their elections firsthand. One of the things that was very inspiring to me is the first polling place that I went to in Kiev. There was an older gentleman, probably in his 70s. He cast the first ballot of the day at the polling place that we were at. And he came up, he cast the ballot, and as he cast his ballot, he said, "For democracy." That was a very moving moment because that is what we saw throughout the polling places that we observed in Ukraine, that they had very high turnout. The Ukrainian people coming out to vote in their elections to choose their president, not a president chosen by Vladimir Putin, a president chosen by the Ukrainian people. And they did it despite what was happening in eastern Ukraine. They did it despite the threats that Russia made against their sovereignty and their country. I think they did it in spite of Russia to say as a message, as a people, that we're going to determine our future. Vladimir Putin, you are not going to determine our future. I found the whole thing inspiring. And why does Ukraine and what happens there matter to the United States of America? First of all, if you look at what is happening in Ukraine, if Russia believes that they can go in and invade the sovereign territory of another country without consequences, what does that mean for the rest of Europe and the security of Europe? Unfortunately, we've seen history like this before in terms of where countries are invaded and other countries act in an apathetic fashion and there aren't consequences to pay for it. What we have heard from our president is if you listen to his speech that he made in Warsaw, Poland on June 4th of this year to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Freedom Day there, it was a moving speech. In that speech, the president said, Ukraine must be free to choose its own future for itself and by itself. So we will not accept Russia's occupation of Crimea or its violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. And it means increased support to help our friends like Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, all of whom are watching what's happening in Ukraine and wondering, will we be next if there are no consequences for invading Ukraine? To help them to provide for their own defense, our free nations will stand united so that further Russian provocations will only mean more isolation and costs for Russia. In fact, as I went to Ukraine to oversee the elections, the president had said, with those impending presidential elections in Ukraine, along with Chancellor Merkel of Germany, that if the Ukrainian elections were interfered with, there would be more costs to Russia. Well, guess what? When I was there overseeing the elections in places like Kiev, where we had record turnout, in the eastern provinces, the Russians continued to foment violence. In Donetsk and Luhansk, the people there did not have the free right to vote, to exercise their decision-making for the future of their country. So where were the costs for that? There were none imposed. In fact, the sanctions that have been imposed, the economic sanctions by this administration, really have not had an impact on Russia. In fact, their stock market's back from where it was before the sanctions, and they feel that at this point, they've gotten away with it, really, because our economic sanctions that we imposed prior to those elections, they imposed some sanctions on individuals, some minimal sanctions on sectoral, but very, very limited. And we've done nothing to actually support the Ukrainians in helping them to defend themselves. So what's happened since the president said costs if you interfere with the election? Nothing happened, even though the Russians continued to foment violence in the east. Flash forward, the Warsaw speech in Poland, where the president said, further aggression by the Russians, there will be costs if they interfere with the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, guess what's happened since then? Since that time, the developments have been absolutely shocking. And I think the Russians are trying to take advantage of what's happening in Iraq, other things happening around the world, thinking that we will lose sight of their illegal invasion of Ukraine and what they are doing in eastern Ukraine. So on June 12th, Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine reportedly acquired T-64 tanks and BM-21 rocket launchers from Russia. So these are the kinds of vehicles, rocket launchers, that Russia is supplying to their agents, essentially, in eastern Ukraine. They're putting tanks, there have been tanks sighted. This is no grassroots movement. Tanks, rockets, all provided by Russia to kill Ukrainian people who are trying to defend their sovereignty. And this has all happened since the elections, adding on the violence that was committed in eastern Ukraine during the elections. The president said there would be costs. There have been no costs for tanks and missile launchers in eastern Ukraine. And in fact, on June 14th, pro-Russian separatists shot down a Ukrainian military transport, killing all 49 people on board in the deadliest episode of months of unrest in eastern Ukraine. Now, this is the type of transport that the Russians, their agents that they backed, shot down. In order to shoot down a plane like this, you have to have the technology to do it. And guess who's giving them that technology? Russia. Yet there have been no costs to that because at this point, the president has just talked. He has not imposed tougher sanctions on the economy of Russia. He has not provided the Ukrainian military with the support. And this is what it looked like when they shot down. Those 49 people were killed, and the Russian agents and their separatists that they are giving the arms to do this shot down that plane, and this is the actual picture from that. At this point, what's the State Department response? What has our administration said? We're highly concerned about the new Russian efforts to support the separatists. We're very concerned. If they don't de-escalate, there'll be additional costs. Well, how many times will our president say, and the State Department say, there will be additional costs if the Russians do anything further? And how many times will the Russians again shoot down the Ukrainian planes by giving these arms to their agents, their separatists? How many more tanks have to cross the Ukrainian border that are Russian tanks before we will impose such costs? Because words don't mean anything to someone like Vladimir Putin. And he knows that we keep talking and we're not acting, so he can keep shooting down their planes. He can keep making sure that the tanks roll over the border, the Russian tanks. This is no grassroots movement with tanks and rocket launchers to shoot down aircraft. This is a subversion where the Russians are also trying to repeat the playbook of what happened in Crimea to further take over the rest of Ukraine. And it is time for us to back up our words with actions. What kind of actions are we talking about? We're talking about legislation that we've offered here in the Congress that I've worked on with Senator Corker and others. Legislation that will impose tougher economic sanctions on Russia that will make a difference to them and their economy. Financial sector sanctions, energy sector, military sector sanctions. Sanctions that will send the message that, yes, this will hurt your economy if you don't respect the sovereignty of another country, or if you continue to escalate the violence by providing not only tanks, but also rocket launchers and shooting down planes of the Ukrainian people. Now, when I had the chance to meet with the new president of Ukraine, he had a request from us. First of all, he wants to make sure that we're tougher than we're being on Russia in terms of sanctions, economic sanctions, so that Russia doesn't continue to invade their territory. And not only that, so that they don't go into other countries in the region. We need to use the economic tools at our disposal so that we aren't forced to use military tools down the line. We have economic tools that this administration is not using to impose costs on Russia and to back up the words of our president rather than continuing to look the other way as the tanks roll in and the airplanes are shot down. What else can we do? So the president asked me about supporting their military. No one wants to send a U.S. troop to Ukraine. No one wants to send our people to fight their battle. But this is what he asked of us. He asked, the former Russian-backed president gutted our military. Can you help get us some basic things for our military? Body armor, communications equipment, night vision goggles, in addition, anti-tank, anti-aircraft capability. What would that do for them? They could defend themselves from the tanks. They could help push back against their planes being shot down. So what they want is the ability and the help to defend themselves. And why should we give it to them? We should give it to them because not only is it the right thing to do so that they can help defend themselves, so we can push back against the Russian invasion of their country, but it is the right thing to do because we were a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine, in 1994, gave up their nuclear weapons. They gave up their nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed. Now, Russia has violated this agreement because the agreement required all parties to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, and the agreement required us and said we would respect not only their sovereignty, but they expected some security assurances because they were giving up their nuclear weapons by signing this agreement. And we can't even give them anti-tank, anti-aircraft equipment so they can defend themselves when they gave up nuclear weapons. What other country in the world is ever going to give up their nuclear weapons when we're not even going to impose tough economic sanctions when they're invaded, when we're not even going to give them some basic military equipment to defend themselves when they're invaded? I would argue that looking at this playbook, no rational country is going to give up their nuclear weapons again in such an agreement if we don't actually follow through in what our president said, which is there will be costs if the Russians continue to invade the territory of Ukraine. Finally, I don't expect us to go alone.
Expired.
Can I have one more minute, Mr. President, please?
Without objection.
By unanimous consent? Thank you.
Objection.
In summary, I don't expect us to go alone. I would ask our European partners to step up too. And it was a shame that the French will continue to sell their recent sale to the Russians to give them further capability of the Mistral-class amphibious assault ships. So shame on the French for that, because Europe is threatened by the Russian aggression here, and I not only expect our country to follow through, but our allies should be held accountable to follow through as well. Mr. President, Ukraine matters. We cannot continue to look the other way as Russia thinks that they can invade another country without consequences. And we can make a difference in this Congress. I would urge the President to follow through on his words. Otherwise, don't say it if you aren't willing to back it up, Mr. President. The Ukrainian people deserve our support. They love America, and all they want is to determine their own future instead of Vladimir Putin determining their future for them. Thank you, Mr. President.